Today marks 40 years since the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. On January 28, 1986, the Challenger took off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
January 28, 1986, 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Launch Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. On board were 7 astronauts: Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, and Ellison Onizuka, payload specialists Gregory Jarvis and Krista McComoff, a high school teacher from New Hampshire. She was set to become the first teacher in space. Millions of students across America were watching this launch live in their classrooms. The excitement was tremendous. At 11:39 a.m., just 73 seconds after liftoff, at an altitude of 48,000 feet, Challenger broke apart. The shuttle had been traveling at nearly 1,900 miles per hour when it disintegrated. A massive fireball erupted in the sky. The external fuel tank ruptured. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen burned explosively. People watching from the ground, families of the astronauts, and millions of children in schools all witnessed this horrifying moment. The cause? A failed O-ring seal on the right solid rocket booster. That morning, Central Florida had been hit by a severe cold wave. Thick ice covered the launch pad. The O-ring, designed to seal joints in the booster rocket, had become brittle in the freezing temperatures. It failed less than 1 second after ignition. But here's what most people don't know. The shuttle breaking apart didn't kill the crew, not immediately. The crew compartment, the cabin where all 7 astronauts sat, separated from the shuttle relatively intact. It broke away in one large piece, and then it began to fall from 48,000 feet. That's about 9 miles above the Atlantic Ocean. The cabin, with the crew inside, was now in free fall. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, it plummeted toward the ocean below. At 11:39:13 a.m., the last voice recorded from the shuttle was pilot Michael Smith saying, "Uh-oh." That was it. The voice recorder stopped functioning moments later. What happened to the crew during those nearly 3 minutes of falling? This is the question that haunted NASA, the question they tried to avoid answering. NASA's official position was careful. They said that the cause of death could not be positively determined, but evidence tells a different story. When investigators recovered the crew cabin, they found something significant. Personal egress air packs, or PEEPs. These are emergency breathing devices that each crew member wears. They had to be manually activated. 4 PEEPs were recovered from the wreckage. 3 of them had been activated. 3 astronauts had turned on their emergency air supply. Dr. Joseph Kerwin from NASA's Life Sciences branch led the investigation into the crew's fate. On July 28, 1986, he released his report. According to this report, the forces during the breakup were probably not sufficient to cause death or serious injury. The crew cabin separated intact, but then the cabin likely lost pressure. At 48,000 feet, there's not enough oxygen to breathe. The report stated that the crew possibly lost consciousness within seconds due to cabin depressurization, but they didn't die then. Death probably resulted from oxygen deficiency minutes before the cabin hit the water. And if the cabin had somehow landed softly, investigators said, the crew could have been revived. One investigator even stated if it had landed softly, they could have swam home. Think about that. The crew was likely unconscious during most of the fall, but the activated PEEPs suggest at least 3 people were conscious enough initially to try to save themselves. They knew something terrible was happening. They reached for their emergency air. And then the cabin hit the Atlantic Ocean. The impact was catastrophic. The crew cabin was traveling at approximately 207 miles per hour when it struck the water. That's 333 kilometers per hour. Hitting water at that speed is like hitting concrete. The cabin was crushed on impact. The The wreckage was compressed into a mound just 6 to 8 feet high. The crew members, who may have been unconscious from oxygen loss, died from the massive trauma of impact. Now the search for the wreckage began. This was a massive operation. The debris field covered an area measuring about 5 miles by 7 miles on the ocean floor. The search area expanded to 420 square nautical miles. On January 31st, the U.S. Navy was tasked with submarine recovery operations. By February 8th, the search formally began with the USS Preserver, a rescue and salvage ship. Eventually, 16 ships joined the operation. 3 managed by NASA, 4 by the U.S. Navy, 1 by the U.S. Air Force, and 8 by independent contractors. The crews used side-scan sonar to search the ocean floor. They discovered 881 potential locations for debris. Of those, 187 pieces were later confirmed to be from the shuttle. The conditions were brutal. Divers had to work in murky water, with visibility sometimes less than 5 feet. Swift currents made every dive dangerous. The depth varied from 70 to 1,200 feet. The solid propellant from the rocket boosters posed a serious risk because it became more volatile after being submerged. On March 1st, sonar located the failed joint on the right solid rocket booster. On March 7th, Navy divers identified what they believed to be the crew compartment. It was designated as Target 67 in the search grid. On the next day, March 8th, at about 11 a.m., 2 divers from the USS Preserver descended to confirm it. One of them was Commander John Devlin. The other was astronaut Robert Bajian, who had joined the recovery effort. Visibility was poor. The condition of the cabin was worse than they expected. It looked as though it had been blown up by a bomb and then swept into a pile on the ocean floor. The cabin material was terribly broken, spread over a 60-foot oval area. But there was the hand controller for the shuttle's manipulator arm. This was it. This was the crew compartment. And yes, human remains were present. On March 9th, NASA announced to the press that the crew cabin had been found. The recovery operation intensified. But there was a problem. A storm was building. Heavy weather was approaching. The crews worked frantically. Commander Devlin later recalled, "It came down within 5 degrees of vertical. The cabin had hit the ocean nearly straight down. The impact had been direct and devastating." The first wreckage and remains were brought up on March 8th. The USS Preserver returned to Port Canaveral that night under the cover of darkness. It was about 11 p.m. when the ship docked. The atmosphere was grim. Crew members later described it as the grimmest night in a business where grim nights are common. An honor guard met the ship. Military ambulances waited. Astronaut Robert Overmyer supervised as bags and containers were unloaded. Inside were the remains of the Challenger crew. The remains were transported to Patrick Air Force Base Hospital, about 25 miles from Cape Canaveral. There, pathologists from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology began the difficult work of identification. The bodies were not intact. The intense forces of the ocean impact had caused massive trauma. As Marvin Resnick, father of astronaut Judith Resnick, later stated in an interview, "There are no bodies, mind you. There are just bits and pieces. I don't know how I can say that nicely. Even though the cabin was partially intact, the crew was not. They really were blown apart."
The recovery operation continued through April. The USS Preserver made multiple trips to the wreck site and back to port. By April 4th, about 75% of the crew cabin had been recovered. Then, heavy weather forced a halt. The ocean deposited a layer of silt over the remaining debris. During the recovery, one of the crew members, Gregory Jarvis, his body floated away and was not located until April 15th, several weeks after the other remains had been identified. 8 ships participated. 50 divers, most of them Navy personnel, spent a total of 100 hours on the ocean floor. The conditions were terrible. The currents were strong. The visibility was minimal, but they persisted. On April 19, 1986, NASA released a statement. Remains of each of the 7 Space Shuttle Challenger crew members have been recovered. The identification process was painstaking. Pathologists used dental records, medical records, and other forensic methods. Some identifications were made relatively quickly, others took longer. The remains were severely damaged. But by mid-April, all 7 astronauts had been positively identified. On April 29, 1986, the remains were transferred. A C-141 Starlifter aircraft carried them from Kennedy Space Center to the military mortuary at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Each casket was draped with an American flag. An honor guard stood at attention. Astronaut escorts accompanied the fallen. The scene was solemn. After arriving at Dover, the remains were released to the families of the crew members for final arrangements. Each family made their own decisions. Ellison Onizuka was buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. Ronald McNair was buried in Restlawn Memorial Park in Lake City, South Carolina, though his remains were later moved to the Dr. Ronald E. McNair Memorial Park in the same town. Judith Resnick was cremated, and her ashes were scattered over the water. Krista McAuliffe was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Concord, New Hampshire. Gregory Jarvis was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean. But there was more. Some of the crew members' remains could not be identified individually. These unidentified remains were treated with special care. They were cremated together. All 7 crew members' remains were commingled, meaning they were mixed together. On May 20, 1986, these remains were buried at the Space Shuttle Challenger Memorial in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. The memorial is located in Section 46, Grave 1129. 2 crew members, Commander Francis Scobie and pilot Michael Smith, also have individual graves at Arlington. The investigation into what caused the disaster was extensive. President Ronald Reagan appointed a commission, later known as the Rogers Commission, to investigate. The commission included notable figures like astronaut Neil Armstrong and physicist Richard Feynman. They determined that the O-ring failure was caused by the unusually cold temperatures on the morning of the launch. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, had warned NASA that the O-rings were only qualified to operate at temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. On the morning of January 28th, the temperature was 18 degrees. Bob Ebling, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, recalled the decision to launch. "We're only qualified to 40 degrees. We tried to stop it." But the warnings were not heeded. The launch proceeded, and 7 people paid with their lives. This raises important questions. Why was there no equipment to help the crew escape? Why no emergency locating transmitter? NASA had failed to prepare for this possibility. There were no parachutes, no escape system, no way for the crew to save themselves once the shuttle broke apart. They could do nothing but ride it down. The psychological impact was profound. This was the first fatal accident involving an American spacecraft during flight, the first American human spaceflight mission to launch and fail to reach space. Millions watched it happen live. Children in classrooms saw their teacher, Krista McAuliffe, die before their eyes. The nation mourned. President Reagan postponed the State of the Union address that was scheduled for that evening. Instead, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office about the disaster. Today, nearly 40 years later, we remember. 7 asteroids were named after the crew: 3350 Scobie, 3351 Smith, 3352 McAuliffe, 3353 Jarvis, 3354 McNair, 3355 Onizuka, and 3356 Resnick. A tree for each astronaut was planted at NASA's Astronaut Memorial Grove at the Johnson Space Center. The Forever Remembered exhibit at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, which opened in July 2015, includes a 12-foot section of Challenger's recovered fuselage. The exhibit allows visitors to see the physical evidence of the disaster and remember the crew. If you found this video informative, there are many more stories of courage,
tragedy, and human resilience to explore. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.